Hey YouTube. So I picked up a new tool and I'm pretty excited about this one because I think it's something fairly unique. Now I have plans to restore some old car parts and I was looking for a better solution to clean up the rusty nuts and bolts or old corroded hardware. And in the past I've used something like a bench grinder to clean up the hardware one by one, but that can be a tedious and messy process. And in my current situation, I don't have access to a garage or a workspace, and I'm limited to working indoors most of the time. So something like a bench grinder is really out of the question. So I had this idea to use a parts tumbler to clean up all that hardware, and I think this machine might come in handy for other projects as well. So what this is a metal vibratory tumbler. And basically it's a basket that sits on top of an oscillating motor. And you can put your hardware along with some abrasive media into the basket. And the motor will vibrate the basket at a high rate of speed and tumble the contents inside. And gradually over time, the abrasive media will clean up your hardware, and depending on the type of media you use, you can also polish your hardware as well. So I picked up this one from Princess Auto on sale for $75. It has a 5-pound basket and it vibrates at 60 Hertz. And I think it's comparable to a similar product you can buy from Harbor Freight. Now let's get this thing opened up and we'll take a look. And this one comes with 3 pounds of walnut shell abrasive media included in the package. Here's what it looks like inside. And it has a sealed lid to keep the contents inside. So I think this walnut media is not going to be abrasive enough for the type of hardware I want to clean up. I think this is typically used for polishing or finishing hardware. So what I've done is I've picked up this other type of tumbler media. It's a resin-based polishing media. It's harder and it's shaped in these triangles and square pieces. Each of these 2-pound bags of the resin media was about $17, so it's not very cheap. When you compare that to just a few dollars for these 1-pound bag of walnut media. And what I've done is I've picked up my trusty jars of old corroded hardware and I'm gonna test out how this works. I think what I'll do is I'll start with the walnut media just to be safe and see how it performs over a few hours, and then if I need some more abrasion I'll move to this resin media. So what I've done is I've gone through and picked a nice mix of hardware that I can test with both types of media. I'm trying to get a mix of large, bulky hardware. I think these exhaust hangers are going to be a good thing to try out. But I've also tried to find some intricate hardware, like these small bolts with fine threads. And then I found a few things that have a bit of paint on it to see, how well the media will remove the paint. Some stamped steel parts. So what I'm going to do is divide these into two groups, and I'll test one with this walnut media and the other group with this resin media, and see what the results are. So here's what I've got set up. I've got two piles of pretty equal items. So I've got some exhaust hangers that have a varying level of rust, and I've picked out some bolts that are not really corroded, but they could be cleaned up. And then I found some of these plated bolts where the bolt is clean but the head isn't. So I'm gonna see how the rust cleans up, and I'm also curious to see if it's gonna remove the plating. Then I've got some sheet metal parts. This one actually has some embossed lettering on it, so let's see how that comes out. And I'm gonna start with the walnut shell media. I've filled it with 2 bags, so only 2 pounds, just to start off with, because this thing is rated for a total weight of 5 pounds, and I think with all of these items in here it'll be close to that. So I'm going to start off with just 2 pounds of media and see how that goes. I've got a zinc plated bolt here, and I'm going to see if it removes the plating. So I've got it plugged in here, and I think I'm going to leave it running overnight and see what the results look like. So here's the first batch of parts. I left this running overnight for about 6 hours in total. So let's see what they look like. I noticed this thing vibrates really hard, and at one point it actually loosened the wing nut off the stud. So from there on I put it on pretty tight. Cleaned up pretty well. You can still see there's a bit of pitting, but it looks like it has cleaned up some of the metal here. Okay, I'm gonna empty this out, clean these parts up, and then we'll take a look. Okay, so here's the parts after the walnut media, and I just cleaned them up in this bucket with some soap and a brush. So let's take a look. They are definitely cleaner, and you can tell where the bolts on these, the nuts on these exhaust hangers were. It's still dirty. You can see it's a little bit shinier. There's some areas that are polished. However, if you take a look at the bracket, this is a much better picture. So you can see there's still a lot of pitting. It didn't really clean up the metal. Like, I would not consider this ready to paint, but it took off a good chunk of corrosion. Still see, you can make out the lettering, but it's quite rusty still. So I think with the walnut media, this would need a lot more time. Here's that stamp. You can see still pretty rusty. All the pieces have like some shiny areas, and what I think is those areas are probably just rubbing against other metal parts, so they cleaned up a lot nicer, but in general still a lot more rust. This one still has paint on it. These are like engine bolts, so they're pretty hard, and I didn't really expect them to get that much cleaner. Here are the plated bolts. You can see the head is still pretty rusty, so this would need more work to get ready before I can paint it. And you can see it didn't really take off any plating. This might be hard to see on camera, but this, you can see some of the plating has worn off a little bit, and the head is more dull than the shaft, because I think it's just a bigger area, and the shape sort of promotes more abrasion. So the head is more dull and less plated, whereas the shaft and the threads are still have their plating on them. This drive shaft bracket, definitely cleaner, smoother, but not really ready for paint. What I noticed is some of these smaller parts, the walnut media was really stuck in between these washers, so I had to kind of scrape it out with a screwdriver or something. You can see definitely like around edges where there are edges that are easy to catch, and they are a bit more polished because they probably, while they were vibrating in there, they probably ran into other metal parts and they were able to get more polished. This bolt came out pretty nice. It cleaned off some of the rust at the top, but again, it's not as hard of a bolt as some of these like head bolts, so cylinder head bolts, so this one's probably easier to clean up with walnut media. The way I took this out is I used this colander, and it was kind of the perfect size to let all the media drop out in between and catch all the hardware, and I just kind of emptied it out into a bucket, and then I fished out the big parts by hand, and just used this colander and emptied it out into a bucket, and took all the parts out, washed them, and then there's the three pounds of media. It fits into a large size Ziploc. So pretty easy way to clean this up and fish out your parts. I'm curious to see what I'm gonna do with the resin media, because I think it'll be too big for this colander. And some of the parts that I want to put in there are probably the same size as the media, so I think it'll be a little bit harder to fish out. But yeah, that's the walnut media. Now let's go set up for the resin media. So now I have this resin media loaded up in here. I've gone with 1.5 bags. If you remember, these were 2-pound bags. And I found with the walnut media, I did end up filling all 3 pounds that came with this kit. And even with the added weight of all the parts, it seemed to hold up fine. So I think I'm going to try the same with this 2.5, about 3 pounds. And yeah, let's give that a try. I am opting out from putting very small fasteners like this, because I think when I try to empty it, it'll be very hard to sort of distinguish and funnel out any sort of small bits versus these media bits. So they're pyramid shaped. They definitely smell funny because they're made out of resin. But yeah, let's get this loaded up and I'll turn it on overnight and see how it goes. So here we have the load that's been done with the resin media. Again, I left it running overnight for about 6 hours. Let's take a look. It's looking initially like a lot more rust has been removed. So I don't have a colander that can sort of filter out this large media, so I'm gonna have to pull out everything by hand. So let me do that. I'll clean it up in my tub of soap and water, and we'll take a look. Okay, so let's take a look. Definitely way cleaner. You can see there's it's removed most of the rust. It looks more like bare metal. This exhaust hanger is pretty polished. The bracket is pretty bare looking. On this side, it looks like there's a little bit of pitting still left. The sheet metal bracket came out pretty clean, but still a little bit of pitting. Some of the washers that are not hardened are very clean, like there's no residue or any sort of corrosion, anything left on them. But some of these hardened bolts, like chassis bolts, they're still a little bit dark. You can see the media, the resin media is larger, so it didn't do as well with the finer threads. Like this thread here is not very clean. And even with the larger threads, it's struggled. Like there's still some cruds left in here. So are these ready to paint? I don't think so. I think they need a few more hours, but I think a lot of these parts cleaned up a little bit better than the walnut media. Not that the walnut media wouldn't be able to do it, I think it would just take much longer. So yeah, let's compare the two and we'll wrap up some final thoughts. So let's compare. Over here, these are tumbled with the walnut media for 6 hours. And over here, these have been tumbled with resin media in the pyramid shapes for 6 hours. And I hope this comes out on camera, but it's pretty clear to see the difference. All of these walnut tumbled parts still have rust and pitting on them. The coated bolts still have some sort of coating on them. They're just cleaner, but the corrosion hasn't been removed. The hardened bolts still have their color. Everything came out a little bit cleaner, but still very similar to before. You can really see the rust on the sheet metal components, so it's still a little bit rough. Smoothed out from just the abrasion, but you can feel the pitting and the rust. And then over here from the resin media tumbled parts, these you can see are pretty much down to bare metal. All of the rust has been removed. However, I think it could use a little bit more time because on some of the parts, even though the rust is gone, you can still see some pitting. So I think they would need a little bit more time before paint. See, the metal has come out shiny. These head bolts have been polished down to metal, so they've lost some of their darker color. And I didn't notice this until I compared it with the walnut parts, but these two bolts are the same. And you can see the resin media has removed the zinc coating. Not so much on the threads, because I think the media has a hard time getting into the threads, but you can see on the nut and the bolt head, the coating is gone. It's lost its yellowy color, and it's down to bare metal. Now, I found the resin media, because it's larger, it didn't do a very good job with finer threads. And yeah, so most of the threads are still a little bit dirty and a little bit gunked up. Sheet metal parts came out pretty clean, but could use a little bit more time, I think, before they're ready for paint, to remove some of the pitting as well. So yeah, there's the comparison. Okay, so what did we learn? Did this thing serve its purpose? I think so. As I mentioned, I don't really have a setup where I can use a bench grinder, and I needed a solution that could work indoors, and I think this did a pretty good job at that. Does this save time? I think if you can set this up and let it run in the background while you focus on other things, then yes, definitely. Something like a bench grinder takes your hands off your actual work, and it can be time consuming that way. However, if you are waiting on some parts and you're kind of held up by them, then you're going to be waiting a long time while those parts get cleaned in this thing. So it's really up to how you manage your time. Is it quiet? I think that depends on the type of media you're using. This walnut media that I used is more like a thick sand, so it behaves more like a fluid inside the tumbler while it's vibrating, and most of the noise comes from the machine. Whereas this resin media is in the form of these pyramid shaped chips. It's very hard and they rattle against each other, So while the machine is vibrating, these tumble and make a lot of noise. I found that I had to run the machine inside a closed closet, otherwise I could hear it throughout the entire house. Is it cleaner to use? Yes, I think so. If you're a little bit clever with your setup, then you can make things a lot easier. For example, I use this colander to filter out the walnut media and my parts. And then I was able to just dump the media into a Ziploc bag for storage. However, I couldn't really do that with the resin media because this is a lot larger, so I had to pick out all the parts one by one. And then I just washed the parts in a bucket with a brush, and they came out pretty clean. The walnut media is pretty dusty. However, if you're careful with how you pour it into the tumbler or back into your bag, then it's pretty easy to manage. However, I was surprised with how dusty the resin media gets. You can see it created this very fine black dust, and it was so pervasive that it managed to work its way outside the box through this hole. So I can't imagine that's very good for you to breathe in, and I'll be wearing a mask the next time I use this. And what did we learn about the parts themselves? As I mentioned, the walnut media is smaller, so it's better at cleaning up threads, and it's much gentler, so I think it's better for polishing your parts. You can see here on these sheet metal components, it sort of smoothed them out and cleaned them up a little bit, but they're still generally pretty rusty, and it didn't really remove any paint. These plated parts still have their plating on them, whereas the resin media definitely was more abrasive and took the parts down to bare metal. But the media being bigger, it wasn't able to clean up the threads as well. This plated bolt has been cleaned off and has lost its plating, except for the area where it's threaded. You can see the sheet metal still has some pitting, so I think it will need a little bit more time inside the tumbler. I also noticed that the size of this tumbler played a part in how well these components were cleaned up. So this is again a 5-pound tumbler, and it's about 10 inches, maybe 9 inches in diameter. So larger components like these exhaust clamps, they had a harder time cleaning up. You can see where the metal is more polished. It was most likely rubbing against other metal components. But I think this is because this together is so large that it wasn't able to move around sufficiently inside the tumbler. Whereas smaller bolts and things that could move around were a little bit cleaner. I did load this thing up, I think to capacity. I had about 3 pounds of media, both with the walnut and the resin media, and then probably another pound with all of these components, and it didn't seem to stress the motor, and I think it worked out fine. So I would say this tumbler with this size is pretty good for most fasteners and small brackets, but it would struggle with larger components than this. So my final thoughts are that I am pretty happy with this purchase. I went through the trouble of all this testing because I couldn't find a lot of information out there for tumblers in this application. So I wanted to see how the different media would behave with this type of hardware. And now I can see that the risk of damage is pretty low, even with the more abrasive media. So I'm going to jump straight into the parts that I am looking to clean up. And I'll just run the tumbler for a longer period of time and check in periodically until I get the desired results. So thanks for watching, and tune in for more videos on my projects.